Welcome to the Einstein Forum, or watching on Zoom in particular. Are we safe here? While wearing masks, we follow strict regulations, so if you want to come to any of our next live events, please feel comfortable in doing so. It's my pleasure to welcome Kristen Ghodsee. I think it's your third talk at the Einstein Forum over a period of, I don't know, 12 years or something like that. Yeah. Back, and I don't have to introduce her because introducing her is Dr. Juliana Fürst, who is the chair of the Department of Communism and Society at our neighboring institution, the ZZF, Zentrum für zeithistorische Forschung. Herzlich willkommen an euch beiden.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to introduce Kristen Ghodsee, who is an author who has accompanied me, my students, for a long time. Of course, her most famous article, and that's the book, When Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, I have discussed often in class with students and with other people too. Her books are, When Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, also The Second World, Second Sex, Socialist Women's Activism and Global Solidarity, which is, I think, the basis for the talk today. And also most recently, Taking Stock of Shock, Social Consequences of the 1989 Revolutions, which I'm just getting into and find it a very riveting read. She has been a fellow and International Center for Scholars, the Alexandria Institute, the Max Planck Institute, Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies, and most importantly, she has also been awarded a John Steinbeck Fellowship. And today she will be giving a talk on Second World, Second Sex, Socialist Women's Global Solidarity in the Cold War. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was a project that I worked on for the better part of about 12 years. And the animating question for this project was, did Cold War competition over women's rights force the progress of international attention to women's issues? And so obviously this is 12 years of research. It's also a pretty substantial book. So in a 45-minute talk, I'm going to really focus on three key arguments. The first is that contrary to the extant scholarship, I argue that East European state feminists had agency. I also argue that state socialist women's organizations effected positive change for women despite the political constraints in the Eastern Bloc. And finally, my specific case study is the Bulgarian Women's Committee, which actively cooperated with women from the developing world to challenge Western government commitments to women during the UN Decade for Women, which happened between 1975 and 1985. So before I start, it's a little bit different when I do this in a place like Potsdam, but in much of my work, especially when I'm giving talks in the United States, I'm dealing with a lot of Cold War stereotypes. And I've been working on socialism and post-socialism for a really long time. And one of the things is, in particular, when I write about gender issues, is this idea that Cold War assumptions about quote unquote communist women continue to influence the writing of Western women's history. And so there's been a lot of scholarship around the fact that what we know about women in the Eastern Bloc, and particularly these women's organizations, has been filtered through Western scholarship that is quite derisive of these organizations in general. But the derisiveness about the efficacy of these women's organizations is also rooted in kind of a broader set of stereotypes about communist women. So there are these Cold War stereotypes about women who lived under communism. And there are two basic sort of tropes that are very present in, this is especially the 80s in the United States. So I'm going to show you two really brief videos. Maybe you will have seen these before, but the first is a very iconic ad in 1984, which was directed by Ridley Scott for Apple Computers. It was shown briefly during the Super Bowl, and it's sort of gone on to become this incredible iconic ad that many people refer to in terms of, you know, really incredible cinematography for what is ultimately a commercial. And then the second ad that I'm going to show you is from 1987. It's the commercial for the Wendy's hamburger chain in the United States. And some people claim that this ad single-handedly won the Cold War. So both of these ads are based in the Reagan era in the United States. And in the first ad, what you see is a kind of androgyny between men and women. And so that's one stereotype that obviously you can see these pictures that men and women are indistinguishable. And then in the second ad, you will very clearly see the primary stereotype of Soviet women in particular as being fat, ugly, and unattractive. So this is the Ridley Scott ad.
Secure from the pests of incompetent. We are one people, one resolve, one cause. For themselves, we will
January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
So the other thing that's really important about this ad, obviously, is that the 1984 Olympics are also happening. And so this young, attractive woman is supposed to be the American, blonde who is resisting totalitarianism. This is the second ad. This one actually has subtitles, a little bit easier to read.
pay attention, please, thank you. Is next day there? Very nice. Is next evening there? Very nice.
Having no choice is no fun. That's why at Wendy's, every hamburger isn't dressed the same. You'll get your choice of fresh toppings, fresh tomatoes, fresh lettuce, fresh onions, cheese, bacon, and more. Having a choice is better than none.
Is next swim there?
Choose fresh. Choose Wendy's.
Okay, so I think those two ads really wonderfully captured the stereotypes that Americans in particular had about Soviet women. From outside of the popular cultural sphere, however, there was also this issue of the academic and intellectual sphere in terms of politics. So starting in 2005 and continuing until 2010, I started interviewing these two women, Irene Tinker on the right, who was a professor of mine at Berkeley in the 90s, and the woman on the left is Arvon Fraser. Both were very prominent women, American women during the UN decade. And Arvon Fraser actually represented the official US delegation to both Mexico City and Copenhagen. And Irene Tinker was very much involved in the parallel NGO forum in all three conferences that happened in Mexico City, Copenhagen, and Nairobi. After the conferences, Irene Tinker actually served a term on INSTRA, which was the UN Training Institute for Women based in Santo Domingo. And in the 90s, and later in conversations that I had with her, at one point she said to me, you know, when I was at Instra, we would get these reports from the Eastern Bloc, this was especially in the 80s, about how good it was for women there. I just disregarded them as propaganda at the time, but maybe they were true. And when in an oral history interview that I did with Arvon Fraser, as I said, who had served as a member of the official delegation, she said, nobody would have admitted it. And it definitely would not be said by anybody from the US delegation. But it certainly did seem that women in the socialist country, as women had at least more legal equality in the socialist bloc. And so part of this had to do with these state socialist women's organizations, which were largely considered quote unquote totalitarian organizations. They were not independent from the party or the state, and therefore they had no societal influence. So the theoretical underpinning of this claim was the idea of state feminism. And state feminism refers to national machineries that are supposed to support women's rights. And it's usually a descriptive phrase for the gender bureaucracy of Scandinavian countries. But there was this really important book in 1976 where this American-based scholar, Barbara Wolf-Yankar, said that West Germans criticized established women's agencies and party-sponsored groups as a way of controlling women and co-opting women's movements rather than encouraging an autonomous approach to women's rights. The inability of women in communist societies to organize independently clearly hampers female participation, and therefore the national women's committees cannot be said to represent women. Later, as late as 2010, a woman named Barbara Einhorn also repeated this claim. Specifically, she does what I think is really interesting is she uses one example, that of the AfD, and there's no citation for this claim, which is that the official women's organizations, the only such organizations permitted under state socialist rule, were subordinated to and in effect mere executive instruments of government policy. So this had been kind of the reigning view of these women's organizations until 2005. And in 2005, a Chinese historian named Wang Zheng, who's based at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and who did a lot of field work in the archives of the All China Women's Federation, she started to question what she called the limited intellectual parameters of feminist scholars. She writes, the lack of desire or imagination to excavate women's role in the policy-making process in the socialist state may have much to do with fast-held assumption about the socialist state. It is too centralized and monolithic to have any space for women's intervention. She found that communist Chinese women had to walk, quote, a fine line between advocating women's interests and being named bourgeois feminists for seeming to insist on the primacy of gender issues. To make a feminist maneuver effective, it was best to do so under the rubric of the party's central work or statist policies, unnoticed by masculinist leaders, unquote. And what she argued in this series of articles, which ultimately became a book, is that Western feminists ignore this strategy. There was also an exchange 2 years later in 2007 in Aspasia, which is a journal of East European and Southeast European women's history. And the Romanian Mihaela Miroiu, who's a philosopher, argued that while communist women's organizations might have pursued some feminist goals, they did not pursue them exclusively. And therefore, the idea of communist feminism, she claimed, was a contradiction in terms. But in that very same issue, her colleague and my colleague from Bulgaria asked, okay, well, how should we name the women-friendly actions of state socialism? If we understand that they did some good things, what were they doing and why were they effective in doing so? So about 7 years later, I got into a very public tangle with another American philosopher named Nanette Funk, who attacked me, Krasimira Daskalova, Franziska Dahan, and a number of young East European scholars as feminist revisionist scholars who were talking about reactive agency rather than proactive agency. So she was basically saying that these women did things, but they didn't really do them because they wanted to do them. They did them because they were forced to, except for that they were all themselves communists who wanted to do them. So it was a very, very complicated set of arguments that we ended up kind of exchanging a few pieces over. And in the end, you know, I argued that if her definition of agency was that you could only be an agent if what you did was in line with your beliefs. And because these women had beliefs about feminism that were not completely realizable in the system, that therefore their beliefs in communism were not relevant, which I found really problematic. So the key thing that started to really interest me was this East-West competition over women's rights, and why it was that I feel that these women's organizations were as effective as they were, not only within the Eastern Bloc context, but also within the context of the international stage, the international platform of the United Nations. So the first thing that's really important is that when we go and we look at the 1958 National Defense Education Act, the NDEA, which is the piece of legislation that the United States passes in response to the launch of Sputnik in 1957, it specifically earmarks money for the education and training of women. And the argument is that the Soviets were able to put more effort into the space race because they had more women who were training to be scientists. And in 1957, I actually found a really interesting Manpower report of the US government that claimed the Soviet Union was graduating 13,000 engineers that were women in 1957, as opposed to less than 100 in the United States in the same year. It was a huge disadvantage in terms of brain power. In 1961, when President Kennedy signed Executive Order 10980, which established the first presidential commission on the status of women, it's very clear that the language used to justify the formation of this commission is national defense. So there's a lot of anxiety in the United States at this particular moment that the Soviets are able to do the things that they're doing because they're educating women. And then in 1963, this happens. And this is the last video. That's a little sound here.
На орбиту спутника Земли был выведен корабль «Восток-6». На его борту Валентина Терешкова, первая в мире женщина-космонавт, советская женщина, достойная дочь нашего героического народа.
So the Soviets really make a big deal out of the launch of Valentina Tereshkova into space in 1963. It's very important that 1963 is also the year of the publication of The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, as well as the publication of the report from the first Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. But the key thing about this is that this is at a moment in the United States where Americans are literally asking themselves whether women are smart enough to graduate from engineering degrees, whether they can do math appropriately, or whether it will shrivel their ovaries or whatever, right? And so when Valentina Tereshkova is launched into space, this is the reaction you get from the New York Herald Tribune. Soviet blonde orbiting as first woman in space. They don't know what to do with this. This is the title of the Springfield Union, Soviet orbits first cosmonaut, right? So you can see here, there's an incredible discomfort around.
Destined for a rendezvous?
Yes, right. I mean, it's really, really, the whole thing is so gendered in this really complicated way. And as I said, when this report from the first Presidential Commission of the Status of Women is finally published in 1963, Kennedy makes, he has these comments when the report is finally finalized. He says, I think we ought to look as a society at what our women are doing and the opportunities before them. Other societies, which we don't admire as much as our own, it seems to me, have given this problem their particular attention. And as I said, The Feminine Mystique is also published in this year, and it's that's often seen as the watershed moment where the feminist movement in the United States gets launched. And what we don't hear about is the context of the Cold War. And there's a wonderful story, because I don't have time to go into it, but the person who is the chairwoman of the Presidential Commission is Eleanor Roosevelt. It's her last public role. And she herself had become very close with a Soviet sniper during 1942 visit, Ludmila Palpachenko, who came to the United States and had a really big impact on Eleanor Roosevelt's thinking about the things that American women could or could not do. So, but in the interest of time, I'm going to just talk really briefly about my case study of the Bulgarian women's movement and ask about whether they were independent or whether they were effective. And I based all of this research, as I said, about 12 years of research on oral histories, archival analysis, and discourse analysis. The key thing is that they had independent finances and very little money came, almost none came from the state budget. They were able to fund all of their activities from the subscription revenue to this magazine, Untitled Chapter, which was a very, very popular magazine in Bulgaria. And during the 1960s, there were, as in many countries, worrisome demographic declines. And the Committee of the Bulgarian Women's Movement was reorganized in '68, and it was empowered uniquely to deal with this problem of falling birth rates. And so one of the things that this committee did, really contrary to the idea of a totalitarian organization, is that they actually did a survey in 1969 with 16,000 respondents who were women in Bulgaria, and they asked them about their lives. They said, why aren't you having more children, right? What's going on with your lives that is making this so difficult? So the big thing that they found was that who watches the children when mother is working? You can see that the ideal of kindergartens and creches was actually only about 23%. About 8% of kids were at home by themselves while their moms were working. And for the majority, it was still parents who were really looking after the care of children. They also found that women wanted to have more children. So these are the actual placards that were put together for the presentation to the Politburo in 1969 that resulted in a really important piece of legislation, which I'm going to talk about. And they wanted to have more children, but the key thing is that they simply did not have the time. If you, this is a very interesting time budget that was done. And if you add up the amount of time that women are spending on their work and family lives, including the commute, they're working about 14 and a half hours a day in Bulgaria in 1969, which means that they just don't have time to attend to their family or have more children. And there are all sorts of discussions about why this is the case and what the government can do about it. But the key thing that happens, which I find really interesting, is that in order to publish an article about this in Zhenotov Nest, this women's magazine, they actually are criticizing the government's policy. They have to criticize because the Bulgarian government has not invested the money that is necessary to have the kindergartens and creches that they said they would. So what they do, and the name of this article is "Should We Have a Third Child in Our Family?" And if you can't really see it very well, but above the title in small print is this quote from Lenin: "The best way to celebrate the anniversary of a revolution is to concentrate attention on its unsolved problems." Now, I was able to interview the woman who put this article together, and one of the things she told me was quoting Lenin was a great way to get past the censors. So you could write a very critical article as long as the title seemed reasonable and there was a nice quote from Lenin or somebody important, then you could slip a lot of things by and not have to worry and actually have a real discussion about this thing. So the discussion, all of the research leads to this 1973 Politburo decision enhancing the role of women in the building of a developed socialist society. And there are these incredible rights and benefits that I don't have time to go into any great detail about that women gain in 1973 as a result of the survey research that the Women's Committee has done, as well as all of their advocacy efforts, as well as letter writing campaigns and so on and so forth, that results in this Politburo decision, which is very important in the lead up to the 1975 World Conference on Women. The other thing that's really interesting about this Politburo decision is that it explicitly addresses masculinity and it addresses the need to change men's attitudes. So this Politburo decision, this is English translation: "The reduction and alleviation of women's household work depends greatly on the common participation of the two spouses in the organization of family life. It is therefore imperative, A, to combat outdated views, habits, and attitudes as regards the allocation of work within the family, and B, to prepare young men for the performance of household duties from childhood and adolescence, both by the school and society and by the family." And I think this is a really interesting point because many people criticize East European countries for not dealing with gender roles. And this is a clear statement that they were trying. There's also a picture you can see there, the cover of a Jonathan Ness in '87 featured a man, carrying a baby. But even earlier than that, this is an article from 1969 about fathers and the role and importance that fathers play in the family. This is also, I love this, these two images. These are two different articles also about men helping out around the home. This is a man who looks like he's boiling laundry. And then the writer who's got this little typewriter and he's feeding the baby. You notice where the ashtray is right under the baby, right? So he's smoking and writing and feeding the baby. He's multitasking like a good father should. The other thing that the committee was doing, and this was really important, was that they were collecting complaints. And so ordinary women could send letters of complaint both to the magazine Jonathan Ness as well as to the committee. This has been established for many of these women's committees, by the way, talking about housing shortages, employment problems, infertility, birth control, poor quality of consumer goods was a really popular topic. Divorce problems, lack of Pampers and feminine hygiene products was another thing that got discussed a lot. So the key thing about this committee is that they were aware very well that they had a lot of problems. This is a quote from Elena Lagodinova, who was the president of this committee for 22 years. Everything which we have said so far does not mean that we have no problems awaiting their solution or that we do not have further far-reaching objectives. Again, a very common criticism of women's organizations is that they said that the woman question had been solved. And this is very clear evidence that even people working within the women's movement didn't believe that to be the case. So now I'm going to jump out of Bulgaria and I'm going to take you to Africa and how women's rights are part of a Cold War struggle in the developing world. So if you look at the Cold War in 1959, you can see the US and its allies, as well as allied colonies, primarily in Africa. You can see the Soviet sphere of influence there. And by 1982, there's a lot going on, and a lot of that is actually happening in Africa. And so from a very early period of time, women's organizations in the Eastern Bloc were reaching out and collaborating with women's organizations, nascent women's organizations, in what was then called the developing world or the third world. And as early as 1964, there were African women who traveled to Sofia to actually study the maternity clinics, the polyclinics that the Bulgarians had set up, like mother and children's homes. And so I was really interested in tracing the relationships between women in Bulgaria and women in particularly, I was interested in Zambia because I had unearthed a whole cache of letters in the archives between Elena Lagodinova and a woman named Chibesa Kankasa, who was the president of the UNIP Women's League. And so in order to do this, I started my research at the International Institute for Social History in Amsterdam. I ended up in Lusaka in January 2013, working in the National Archives, as well as in the archives of the United National Independent Party, which are our private archive. You can see they're not very well organized. This was a pretty Himalayan lift to get into the archive. And then even while I was in there, just even organizing and navigating my way through the collection was really difficult. But what I did find, first of all, was extensive evidence of bilateral aid between Bulgaria and between many Eastern Bloc countries and Zambia, which technically was non-aligned. And then in 1972 became a one-party participatory democracy. That's what they called themselves. And I also found extensive evidence of exchanges between the women's committees. I was also very fortunate to track down 3, 4, 5 actual women, these 3 in particular, who were very, very prominent Zambian women. Chibesa Kankasa, who has now passed away, was the president of the UNIP Women's League. This woman, Lily Monze, was the Zambian ambassador for France and a very big women's activist for many years. And senior chieftainess Nikomesha, who was the woman in black and white, she was a member of parliament, a very senior member of the Zambian government, and now she is a senior chieftainess. She's one of the most important tribal leaders in Zambia. And I started to look at how all of these networks and relationships played out during the UN decade for women. So the key thing is that the Eastern Bloc was emphasizing that women's struggles should not be separated from larger political struggles. And the First World Congress happened in Mexico City, really kind of over the objections initially of the American government. This is another woman that I interviewed, Mildred Persinger. The US was initially opposed to the UN Conference for International Women's Year, because International Women's Year, by the way, had been proposed by the Eastern Bloc. And there was a big conference that was being organized in East Berlin. And when the American women said that they wouldn't be able or weren't willing to travel to East Berlin for the conference, and they sort of accused the State Department of ignoring women's issues, and that the Soviets were the only ones, the Eastern Bloc countries were the only ones doing something for International Women's Year, suddenly the prospects for a UN Women's Year conference improved. It was a miracle. And Arvon Fraser said, nations have egos, and American feminists played on that in order to get this conference going. So not surprisingly, who did the Soviets send as the head of their delegation? None other than Valentina Tereshkova, who is still widely celebrated as the first woman in space. The Bulgarians send Elena Lagodinova, who's the president of the Committee for the Bulgarian Women's Movement, very highly educated. She had a PhD and a habilitation, and she'd spent 13 years as a geneticist at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. She was flanked by a woman named Svetlana Daskalova, who was the Bulgarian Minister of Justice, and Ludmila Zhivkova, who at the time was the Bulgarian Minister of Culture. Betty Ford really wanted to go, but she was not allowed to go. And instead, the US delegation was headed by a man who was the head of the United States International Agency for International Development. And then many feminists in the United States protested, and at the last minute, a Republican operative named Patricia Hutar was added as co-head of the delegation. Senior Chieftainess Nikomesha went to this conference, and her recollection of this conference was that Mozambique had gotten its independence on June 25th, 1975, which is exactly as the conference was happening in Mexico City. And since Frelimo had been aligned with the socialist bloc, and there were a big group of African delegates in Mexico City, they had a big party. They invited a bunch of people to celebrate Mozambican independence. And this was basically like an anti-American fest. And so this is a recollection of Arvon Fraser. American women learned that they could be the target of public vilification, which shocked many of them deeply. The new US women's movement had taught many American women to think that all women were friends, think of all women as friends, people united in a common cause. To find this not true in their first international encounter was to some an infuriating and very disappointing experience. Another American woman who was at the Parallel NGO Forum, Jane Jacquet, recalls, I found North American feminists surprised to discover that not everyone shared their view that patriarchy was the major cause of women's oppression, and that third world women held views closer to Marx than Betty Friedan. On the other hand, Elena Lagodinova reports back, in the International Year of Women, everything accomplished by socialist Bulgaria, both politically and practically, was recognized. And the UN named the People's Republic of Bulgaria a country model in which the issues of women, children, and the family have been resolved in the most progressive and humane manner. And for a variety of reasons, the Committee for the Bulgarian Women's Movement becomes the de facto leader of socialist women's organizations for the remainder of the UN decade. And it decides to use the UN to mobilize progressive women, particularly in Asia and Africa. And so what you can see here between 1977 and 78, Elena Lagodinova and other women from the committee are on a kind of a tour of the world. They're meeting with socialist allied countries. They're meeting with countries in the developing world, but they're also meeting with some NATO, women in NATO countries, which is also really interesting, I think. Building coalitions, sort of forging new networks around this idea that women's issues can only be solved by structural changes in the economy. This is Elena Lagodinova in the middle of the podium here in 1977 in Moscow. You can see her surrounded by men, sort of representing, these are all the leaders of the Warsaw Pact countries. This is 1978 opening of the WIDF. This is the Women's International Democratic Federation, an organization that had been started in France and then moved to East Berlin after they were kicked out. You can see that's obviously Fidel Castro in the middle. To his right is Valentina Tereshkova, and to his left is Elena Lagodinova. And this was a center that was created in order to teach Latin American women how to work at the UN. specifically in the lead up to the 1980 Copenhagen conference. So there's also a decision made to create this UN Institute for Training Women in a Third World Country. It is Santo Domingo in Dominican Republic is chosen. And at this moment, Elena Lagodinova writes to the Politburo in Bulgaria to convince them to build a training center for African and Asian women in Bulgaria. And this is a quote from her letter. We believe that the creation of a center for training and preparation of women leaders in a socialist country is a very opportune and useful idea. Bulgaria, serving as the host, would also provide women leaders from both continents a thorough acquaintance with the rich experience of the socialist countries in the resolution of equality and status issues faced by women. So these courses, the idea was to teach women from the developing and or newly independent countries, particularly in Africa, how to work within the UN system in order to sort of fight for changes that would not only be beneficial broadly for their societies, but also for women within those societies. And in 1980, there's the Second World Conference on Women in Copenhagen, and women from the Third World make their voices heard, which means that the US delegation is absolutely humiliated in Copenhagen. They have to go home without actually voting for the United Conference document. And when they get home, the US delegation reports to the House of Representatives that conference tensions, quote, reflected the intense conflict between the group of 77, these are the newly independent countries on the General Assembly, and the Soviet Arab bloc on the one hand and the Western nations on the other. Whereas the Bulgarians say the conference and the forum revealed opportunities for even broader collaboration between, on the one hand, women's organizations from socialist countries, and on the other hand, between our organizations and progressive women's organizations from developing countries. And so what happens in the immediate aftermath of 1980 is this creation of the School for Knowledge, Friendship, and Solidarity. And this is based in Sofia. It is hosted by the Bulgarian Women's Committee and this large umbrella organization, the Women's International Democratic Federation. All of the sessions are simultaneously interpreted into English, French, Arabic, and Portuguese. You have representatives from 5 women's organizations in Asia and 22 different women's organizations from 22 different countries in Africa. It's 40 days long. There are 20 days with 5 hours a day of lectures per day, one-on-one workshops, and then field trips all around Bulgaria. It's fully financed by the Bulgarian Women's Committee and the WIDF, completely independent in terms of financing for the delegates of the Bulgarian government. The great thing about this is that I found the syllabi in the archives, so I know exactly what they were teaching at this school. And this was the political, socioeconomic development, and cultural issues, specifically of the respective continents, as well as the problems of women, how to organize feminist organizations, the need of unity and collaboration in different civic fields for the resolution of women's issues. This means working together with unions, pensioners organizations, youth organizations. But the real key thing that they did was focus on the UN and its specialized branches, to focus on the problems of women and children and what the UN could do in order to promote women's issues globally. So Elena Lagodinova said, we consider this course an expression of our solidarity for your fights for national independence, female equality, and social progress. And the course was repeated in 82. This was specifically now focused on women's organizations from Africa. In the lead up to the 1985 conference in Nairobi, there was a School for Peace, which was organized in 84, and another women's peace workshop, which included West European women, very interestingly, in 1985, in the lead up to the Third World Conference on Women, which was based in Nairobi. And at that conference, Elena Lagodinova, interestingly, is elected as the general rapporteur of the whole conference. So she becomes the face of the global women's movement to the media. And not surprisingly, there's a great video, if I had time, I would show it to you, of her talking about the speech that she made and how nervous she was and what she tried to do, how she used the platform in order to talk about the things that were going on in terms of women's organizing in the socialist world. What was interesting, Lily Monze was also at this conference, and when I interviewed her, she said, and with the women, as you said, from the socialist countries, the cooperation helped. For instance, provision of scholarships for some of the women here to go and study, exchange visits. Sometimes they would come, sometimes we would go over, sometimes they would pay for our attendance at these conferences. It's very clear. And again, I've done the forensic accounting on this. There were massive transfers of money coming from places like Bulgaria, Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, not only in terms of paying for these women to go, giving them plane tickets, organizing their accommodation, paying their meals and their airport taxes. Many of these women were able to go to these conferences because of the generosity of these colleagues of theirs, women's organizations in the Eastern Bloc. What I find so ironic about all of this is that when you then go back and you read American accounts of what happened in Nairobi, this is a quote from a woman, Amrita Basu, quote, women from the third world also more openly criticized oppressive social and political practices than they had in 1975 or in 1980. By 1985, it was clear that third world women were constructing indigenous feminist theory and practices that linked struggle against sexual equality to other political struggles. Now, if you remember from earlier in the talk, this is exactly what all of those workshops in Bulgaria and Havana were about, was the connection between struggles for women's equality and other political struggles. So this is another big WIDF conference that happens in 1987 in Moscow. And this is an image of Elena Legadinova presiding over the last Women's International Democratic Federation conference. You can look at the date. You look carefully here. Challenges and Future Perspectives in a Changing World is the name of the conference. Council meeting Sofia, 12th to the 15th of September, 1989. So I have no idea exactly how much the world was about to change. Now, the sad story about all of this is that there is a fourth world, the fourth and final World Conference of Women was held in Beijing in 1995. And by the time we get to Beijing, I'm just going to read this because it speaks, you know, this is a press release. It speaks volumes about what happened to all these women from the Eastern Bloc. Eastern Europe was the odd region out during the Fourth World Conference of Women, which concluded here today. As the 17,000 participants packed their bags to return home with a new document on the advancement of half the world's population, the women from Eastern Europe admitted that in the deliberations from September 4th to 15th, they seemed to be a non-region. They did not take their marginalization lying down. The women distributed at the Beijing International Conference Center a map identifying the location of the countries they represented. Their objective, to remind people that they existed and of the ruptures caused in their lives by the end of the Cold War. And so when we get to the historiography by 2004, this is a book actually edited by Arvon Fraser and Irene Tinker, two of my previous mentors. There are essays from 27 women from 12 different countries, but not a single one from the Eastern Bloc or a socialist country in Africa. Those stories, that organizing is just completely erased from the record. The only place it shows up is in this Women Development and the UN. This is an intellectual history of women at the UN by Devika Jain, an Indian economist, quite well-known Indian economist. And she says, the disintegration of the East and West blocs critically impacted the approach to development. The socialist bloc had supported approaches that required a strong state, a thrust toward public provision of basic services, and a more equitable global economic program, such as the new international economic order. It was often an ally of the newly liberated states as they attempted to forge coalitions, such as the non-aligned movement or the Group of 77, to negotiate with their former colonial masters. The fading out of the Cold War led to the dimming and reduction of value of this third space, which in later years removed a vital political umbrella that had sheltered the women of the South, given them a legitimacy to stake a claim for justice as part of the movements to address domination, unquote. Similarly, my colleague here, based in Germany, Augusta Dimu, said in analysis of contemporary German history textbooks, they ignore, quote, the massive impact of leftist intellectual influences on the articulation of the liberation movements in the third world, in spite of the fact that decolonization is a standard topic in history textbooks on the 20th century. So it's not just the women's organization, right? It's the entire narrative of socialism and, you know, this alternative path to modernity gets sort of written out of the narrative about national independence. So in this book, what I've tried to do, and I'm just giving you really the kind of overview, the précis of the entire thing, is to trace these interconnections and transnational networks between socialist women in the Eastern Bloc, as well as between their counterparts in progressive women's organizations in Africa, some of which were organized by the state and some of which were marginally independent of the state. I focus very specifically on a sort of troika of Bulgaria, Zambia, and the United States, and show how these narratives all sort of circulated and the tensions that were caused East and West because of the increasing appeal of socialist women's organizations to women in the developing world of the South. And, you know, one of the questions I often get, and it is often discussed in the context of the United States, is whether or not communist women's activism actually hurt women's movements in the West. So if you actually look at the 1950s in the United States, for instance, if you were advocating for women's emancipation, people automatically assumed that you had to be a communist, right? And so there was a way in which women who were advocating for women's rights were easily tarred by the brush of being a red, and that undermined their cause. But in fact, I argue, and I think it's really important to try to excavate this narrative. And I think there is also really wonderful research that could be done, for instance, in the German context or in the French context or in the British context, that it might be that there was an unacknowledged kind of Sputnik moment for the global women's movement, that precisely because the Eastern Bloc paid so much attention to women's issues at the global level, particularly at the United Nations, it sort of forced in many ways Western countries to respond. It sort of forced male leaders in the West to kind of expand their provisions for women's equality. And I can give multiple examples of this. If we look at like Title IX legislation around women's participation in sports in the United States, for instance, it's very clear that it's a direct response to the fact that the Eastern Bloc countries, and particularly the Soviet Union, kept beating the United States in the medal count because they were dominating the women's sports. And women, American weren't fielding enough women athletes. So there are lots of little places where you can look and see where the American government was kind of forced to respond or invest in American women as a response to perceived investments in women's rights in the East. All right, that's the end of my presentation, and I'm very happy to take questions. Thanks.
Much for absolutely riveting and engaged presentation. I realized while you were talking that in a very small way, I'm part of your story because in 1995 I worked as an intern for the WHO and was assigned to the section preparing the WHO provision for the Women's Congress in Beijing. And in fact, my boss was an Egyptian lady who had been trained at MUU in Moscow. So there we go, the traces of history. I'm privileged as a moderator to ask the first question, and I will actually do a question which has accompanied me for many years, and I'm sort of kind of looking for an interesting answer from you, but you touched yourself on it in your talk when you said that women from the third world, or that American women were sometimes disappointed to see that women from the third world were more into Marx than Betty Friedan. And it's exactly that kind of tension of different notions of feminisms, which I find very interesting, but also sometimes hard to comprehend how that development took place. So on the one hand, of course, we have the sort of Western influenced second wave feminism of Betty Friedan, but also Simone de Beauvoir and Alice Schwarzer here in Germany. And then you have the state feminism, which of course didn't call itself feminism. And I'm always actually amazed how come that these two kind of feminisms could not talk to each other, not then, and when in the 1990s there was an encounter and people, that there was sort of a space where these kind of feminisms did go onto congresses together in Moscow, etc. it was absolutely clear that they misunderstood each other. I mean, for example, Baranskaya very strongly rejected the label feminism for her famous essay on time management, really, and for the most of the 1990s and 2000, feminism was an absolutely dirty word in the Russian context, at least, and I think it was true for most of Eastern Europe. So my question really is, how come these two feminisms, which actually, I mean, one of them said the personal is the political, the other one the political is personal, but how come there was no meeting of minds? Was that really a consequence of the Cold War, or is there more deeper philosophical issue at stake?
Yeah, so there's a much deeper philosophical issue, and it far predates the Cold War, right? So I think when we go back and we think about the history of what's called often first wave feminism, the suffragettes, right? Or the suffragists in the US, the suffragettes in the UK, there was a real tension around, there were two problems that women faced specifically in the UK. One was that women weren't allowed to vote. And the second was that people without a certain amount of property weren't allowed to vote. And so many of the suffragettes were unconcerned about the property restrictions. What they took umbrage with was the fact that propertied women were not allowed to vote. And similarly, there were things like the Marriage Women Property Act, so that married women could keep their property, and it didn't automatically, through the doctrine of coverture, become the property of their husbands upon marriage. And if for some reason the relationship was dissolved, it remained their property. So many of these very early, what we think of as early white Western feminist movements, there were some exceptions, but largely, generally speaking, they came from a place of extreme privilege, and they were trying to open up the professions, open up the universities, so that the daughters of wealthy bourgeois and aristocratic families could study. At exactly that same moment, you have people like August Bebel and Clara Zetkin here in Germany. You have Alexandra Kollontai in the Russian context. You have Flora Tristan in France, right? Who's articulating a very, very different vision of women's emancipation. And I mean, Flora Tristan, the workers' union is 1843. So it's in her vision, the workers, and there is no emancipation for women without emancipation of the workers, and vice versa. You cannot emancipate the workers if you don't emancipate the women. Those two things go hand in hand. And this really comes back to Engels' idea that the nuclear family, the bourgeois monogamous nuclear family, is the institution in society that allows for the intergenerational transfer of private property. So in order to challenge this intergenerational transfer of private property, which is what the socialists see as part of the cause for systemic inequalities, you have to attack the family, you have to challenge the family, and that means the emancipation of women. So philosophically, right, the bourgeois, what Kollontai and Zetkin refer to as the bourgeois feminists, right, they are fine with the family. They're fine with the intergenerational transfer of property. In fact, they like the fact that property is transferred the way that it is. They don't want to challenge for instance, whether illegitimate children born outside of wedlock can inherit, right? They like the way the system works. They're just annoyed that they don't have any control over the property and that they don't have the franchise. And so I think that the key thing is in the narrative of feminism that we often get the first, second, third wave, right? Dorothy Sue Cobble talks about the missing wave, which is these women, many of whom were communist, socialists, some of them anarchists in the 30s, who go and fight in Spain. And they become very radicalized during the Spanish Civil War. And many of them, you have African-American women who join the CPUSA in the United States context, but you have many women who come into their women's emancipatory politics through the struggle of the Spanish Civil War and then the Second World War. Some of them are partisans. Elena Lagodinova herself was a partisan. So there's a way in which fundamentally, if you are what they would call themselves would be socialist women's activists, right? Or communist women's activists. They did not like the word feminism. You're absolutely right. The restructuring of the family and society is a necessary precondition of women's emancipation. If you're a Western feminist, society can be left alone, the family can be left alone, extant property relations and economic relations can be left alone. All you need to do is open the door so that women can join in the exploitation. That's the key. And I think that Nancy Fraser wrote a wonderful article in the 90s called, Feminism, Capitalism, and the Cunning of History, right? Where she talks about how feminism in the United States concept became the handmaiden of capitalism, right? And I think that what you see in the context of contemporary politics, the kind of Me Too, hashtag girl boss, liberal feminism, which is all about women working harder, right? Women working so that they can become members of the boardroom equal with men, right? Or they can become politicians or people with power and influence. That's irrespective of the vast majority of women in society. This is a kind of almost sort of feminist tokenism. As opposed to, I think, women who are very much, again, there's this book, Feminism for the 99%. There's a resurgent group, I would call, I'm hesitant to use the word socialist feminist, but that's what they often get called, who are really talking about, no, you cannot just allowing, having the 1% be gender balanced is not the goal of our movement, right? We don't want there to be a female Jeff Bezos or a female Elon Musk or a female Zuckerberg, right? That's not the goal, to have an equal number of super billionaires that are men and women. The goal is actually to abolish the class of billionaires so that everybody lives a better life. And in the process of doing that, then women will also benefit greatly by the expansion of social safety nets, by the kinds of state provision of social services that Devaki Jain talks about. The problem is that's expensive, right? That level of social care. So that's one big part. And then there's also the part of the essentialization of the category of women, especially as mothers. And socialists have always tended to come down, these what I would call socialist women's activists, on the issue of, the thing that's really important is to allow women to balance their productive and reproductive labor roles. And a lot of liberal feminists don't even want to talk about the reproductive. They just want that to not be an issue. They want to look at men and women as equal, and whatever differences do exist, they're to be ignored and not legislated for because they create inequalities that are uncomfortable for the narrative of liberal feminism. So I think this debate starts as early as 1843. With Flora Tristan when she publishes the Workers' Union, and it continues through Engels and Bebel and Zetkin and Kollontai, and there's a whole kind of trajectory of women who are saying, we have a completely different view of how women's emancipation needs to be realized. And that strand often gets ignored in feminist histories, partially because, as Mihaela Miroiu says, they weren't exclusively concerned with women's autonomy. And so you can't really call them feminists because they had other agendas as well. And so to me, at the end of the day, that's just a semantic argument, right? Okay, maybe we can't call them feminists, but they were still doing women-friendly things. That's what Daskalova says. Well, what do we call them? And so, and then that's just a question of naming. That's just a question of labels. I think the most important thing is we should not allow, and I feel really strongly about this, that a lot of the gender backlash that's happening in Eastern Europe right now is a gender backlash against this sort of liberal girl boss feminism that has come to stand in for women's activism around women's emancipation. And there's this whole other really deep, interesting, fascinating history that goes back to the middle of the 19th century that gets completely ignored because it's uncomfortable. Because they were many of them were communists. They weren't all communists. Some of them were just boring social democrats like Lily Braun. But nevertheless, she gets associated with this other way of organizing women's emancipation that requires much larger demands on the state, and ultimately reformations of the family. And that's the sticking point as well. The family is really, really hard to get into.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'll first ask if there are questions in the room. Misha.
This is from me, not from the chat. So thanks a lot. This was really fascinating on many levels, and I have lots of questions, and maybe I'll ask two. The first is about Bulgaria. So why, I mean, I know that Bulgaria is your home turf.
Yeah.
But it seems from your story that, you know, beyond that, there seem to be reasons why Bulgaria was at the forefront of all of this. And I'm wondering why, because obviously, especially from a Soviet perspective, you know, Bulgaria was always considered the 16th Republic, you know, not really independent. So, you know, what made the Bulgarian women's movement in particular so active on an international scene? The second is about, and this kind of continues your exchange that you have right now with Juliana about social movement continuity, right? There's this famous article in the American context by Verta Taylor about the women's movement in abeyance, right? So the question of continuity between the first wave and the second wave. And I'm wondering about the post-socialist feminist movement, which, as you just said, basically threw the whole history overboard, right? And I mean, I don't know the Bulgarian context, but certainly in the Russian context, if you talk to women who started identifying as feminists during perestroika in the 1990s, I mean, usually they're much closer to what you describe as the Western model, right? Yeah. The private is the person's political, you know, it's my body, etc., etc., etc. And I mean, I'm not aware of any references to the socialist era prehistory, but I'm wondering if there were any continuities that, you know, might not lie on the surface, but that nevertheless was still there in terms of, I don't know, personal networks or discussions behind closed doors. You know, is there any kind of continuity, or would you say that with the collapse of socialism came kind of almost an invasion of Western style feminism that completely pushed that earlier history into the background?
Yeah, okay, so those are two fascinating questions, and I could, you know, I have to hold myself back because I could talk about this stuff for a long time. So the first question is an easier one to address. There are sort of three reasons. The first is that Tereshkova and Lagodinova were very good friends. Tereshkova as a person was much more interested in issues of peace than she was in women's issues in particular. So she really wanted the Soviet Women's Committee to focus on issues of peace. She had a kind of narrative that if, you know, women are more peaceful, is a very sensualist sort of narrative about women. But that was partially related to the fact that during the UN conferences, as I'm sure you know, Albania and China in the non-aligned movement specifically were accusing the Soviet Union of being an imperialist power, specifically China. And this comes out in Mexico City at that first World Conference. China tries to insert a clause that condemns superpower hegemonism, which is clearly an attack on both the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Soviets have to negotiate really carefully with using UN rules to get that taken out. It's very tricky. I write about what they do in the book. It's a very clever thing that they do. But basically, Bulgaria could claim post-colonial status because it had been colonized by the Ottoman Empire for 500 years. The Yugoslavs similarly did that in their organizing that's why they were so successful with the non-aligned movement, because they could say, we were colonized too. Similarly, Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, and to a certain extent, Romania, prior to 1945, were really pretty backward peasant economies. And they didn't have the level of industrialization of some of the northern countries. And so to the extent that they were appealing to the members of women's groups in the developing world, but also more broadly to the developing world, they could say, look, we are underdeveloped and we are post-colonial too. And that gave them, and in all of their literature, you can see very clearly that they constantly emphasize that. So that's why I think the Soviets on the women's issue, the Cubans took the lead with the Latin American women, and they gave the Bulgarians the lead with the African and Asian women, because the Soviets wanted to not be acting like a hegemon in this case. And I think it was a very successful strategy. ultimately, Lagodinova and Tereshkova were very good friends and they coordinated everything. But when it came time to elect the general rapporteur at Nairobi, it wasn't Tereshkova, it was Lagodinova. And I think that's really important. They let the Bulgarians take the lead on this one. So your second question about rupture and continuity, I'll just tell you a little story. I was giving a lecture online, and it was a Zoom lecture to Russians in Russia. And in the question and answer period, a young Russian woman said, you know, I'm a feminist and I'm studying gender studies. And all we learn about in Russia is Judith Butler and gender performativity and Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem. And I can't believe that I'm hearing about Alexandra Kollontai from you, right? Like, this doesn't make sense. Like, why aren't we in the Soviet Union learning, in Russia, you know, learning about our Soviet past? Similarly, I just finished a chapter on Kollontai's biography with a Russian historian who was actually working with Kollontai's papers in Moscow. And we had this long conversation about how Kollontai is remembered today in the Soviet Union. I keep saying the Soviet Union, as a Soviet member of the Soviet Union in Russia. And she is lauded as a diplomat. She is constantly celebrated as this really important figure by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, but her feminist activism and her early writings in the 1920s are completely ignored. And so I do think that there's a huge rupture, especially in the Russian context. There was a way in which there was just like everything that had been done during the socialist era needed to be discarded. And there was very clearly a kind of cultural imperialism around feminism in the 90s, because the United States, the UK, and then an organization in the Netherlands called Mama Cash, they were the primary funders of new women's organizations in all of the former socialist countries in Eastern Europe. And they specifically chose to fund organizations that had no connections to the previous women's committees, that had experience. And so one of the problems in 1995 is that there was very little continuity in the delegates that had gone to the previous conferences. They were alive, but they weren't invited to represent their countries because they had largely all been members of the previous regimes, and there was a lot of lustration going on. I will say that recently, and this is partially because of the work of Franziska de Haan at the Central European University before they got kicked out of Budapest and relocated, she has really started training, beginning in 2007, a generation of young East European, mostly historians, a few of them sociologists and anthropologists, who are actually recuperating a lot of this history. And I think that what has happened in the Eastern European context right now is, to the extent that you have what they're calling like gender backlash in places like Poland or Romania or Bulgaria, there is a move among some younger feminists to say, hey, feminism isn't something imported from the West. We had really strong feminist movements in our countries too. And part of that is about excavating the history of these women's committees and what they actually did to promote women's rights. And, you know, I read all of this stuff. So, you know, in the case of Poland, it's so clear that the communists were very uncomfortable, for instance, with sex education in schools. And it was the Women's Committee that was really pushing for really, really progressive sex education in the Polish context. Also, the protection of abortion in Poland throughout the communist era, which, you know, was immediately overturned afterwards. So it's different in different countries, but I think that a lot of that research is being done. And a lot of these women, at least until very recently, were alive. And so there's a lot of oral history going on. And I think that some of this is now starting to be recovered in a really important way. And so I'm hopeful that there will be more continuity. But I think in the 90s, there was just massive rupture. And there was very, very little willingness to go back and actually see what these socialist women's committees were doing, partially because the narrative from the West was that they were all tools of the party and they didn't actually do anything on their own. And that was that big, you know, public debate that I ended up having with Nanette Funk, was precisely about that question. Yeah.
I just wanted to add, however, that in the 90s, I would say second wave feminism wasn't particularly accepted or popular in the post-socialist sphere either. It's possibly it was a time zero in that kind of regard. But Susan, you have a question.
Yeah, I have questions now for everybody, but I'll keep them short. I'm not sure, Kristen, if you know that Misha is Russian. Okay, you do know this because no one would guess from listening to, but I am curious as to whether your impressions of Russian feminism today jive with Misha's impressions. Just okay. Just curious, as to how broad those kind of conclusions can be. Here's a very small question. When you were talking about the decision of the Bulgarian Politburo, there was a line about socialization of housework. Does that just mean men and women should both take care of the house?
No.
Or does it mean something else?
It means something else.
What
Yeah.
does it mean?
It means public laundries, public cafeterias. It means public canteens, after school clubs for kids. It was a real sense of, I ended up having a long conversation about this with Elena Lagodinova because they really did try, for instance, to get men to help out more around the house. And they did really clever things to try to do that, right? So, okay, so it is generally the case that women cook in the kitchen in many cultures, but when it comes to grilling meat outside, that this is a manly activity, that men will cook if it's meat on a fire. And it's an interesting, pretty consistent phenomenon. You see this in a lot of cultures, that men grill, women cook. And the Women's Committee thought, well, how can we gender certain tasks masculine so that men will be more likely to do them without feeling that their masculinity is somehow being undermined by performing this task? So they were very clever. And in Bulgaria, when you drink rakia, which is like the local kind of spirits, like grappa, you have meze, and the meze is usually a salad. It's salads. And it's cucumbers, it's, tomatoes, they're cut in a certain way, and you sit and you drink, this is the famous saying when somebody's driving, you say you don't know how many salads he had, which means you don't know how many rakias he had, right? So the Women's Committee said, because meze is something that men eat when they're drinking rakia together, that really men should prepare the meze. And it should be with a special knife, this really big knife, right? Because women don't chop the vegetables the right way. Men have to do it for meze. And it was a very successful way of and men were like, yeah, that's right. I'm gonna chop the cucumbers the way that they're supposed to be chopped, right? So I think that, what they did was they sort of used gender stereotypes and tropes of masculinity and femininity, which is one of the reasons why you can still have an incredible amount of sexism in Eastern Europe, even while you have women's emancipation, relatively speaking, because they didn't challenge gender roles. They sort of strategically mobilized gender roles. And so, but ultimately getting men to cut the cucumbers wasn't enough, right? There was a lot of work that needed to be done. And so they consistently across every single East European country, to a greater or lesser degree, decided that there should be public commitments to cafeterias or public restaurants, like the milk bars in Poland, really cheap, subsidized places in the neighborhood where you could go with your family, get a cheap, decent meal so that the women didn't have to cook. In the Bulgarian context, they had, at the end of the day at the factory where women worked, especially if it was a textile or a food processing factory, sometimes they had meals that were quasi-prepared, right? So they had like the kebabcha and the küfte ready to go, and then like a sack of potatoes, so that the woman could go home and like, it was almost done, right? And she didn't have to go shopping, which was really important. So there were ways in which all these women's committees believed that the socialization of reproductive work, right? This what we call reproductive labor in the home, or social reproduction theory is the fancy term it goes under now, needed to be taken over increasingly by the state. And then that would not only liberate women, but it would liberate families and children from all of this private labor that's done in the home.
to a greater or lesser degree, they did that in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. They did it a lot, right? Kollontai was probably the most aggressive on this. And Kollontai has a really interesting 1916 essay where she basically says, okay, so if we actually ever get power, here's what I'm going to do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then a year later, she's the first social commissar of social welfare. And she sits down and she does 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 until they run out of money, you know, the Civil War, and there's all sorts of other things that happen. And so it gets shut down. But I don't think it was ever about an equitable distribution of reproductive labor between men and women in the home. And that's really important.
That is really important and really interesting. I didn't know about that. I mean, the one thing that I knew, or at least had read in a couple of places, was that in the DDR, they gave up on trying to get people to do housework equally. And so they gave women extra time off from their jobs, which is still better than nothing. But,
right.
But I have one last question. You talk at the end about the, you know, US, or actually all the way through, making moves towards women's equality under pressure from the Soviet Union. And I know a little bit about the fact that that was also true in racial equality.
Yes.
So it played a big role. I mean, you have statements of both of the Kennedys saying we have to do something about this because, you know, it's being used as propaganda, you know, et cetera. And I just, I'm not quite sure what the question is, but I wonder if you have a take on how this fits together.
Oh, I think they're absolutely related, right? That the civil rights movement, I mean, Mary Dudziak's book, Cold War Civil Rights, is precisely this really wonderful argument about how sort of Soviet grandstanding about race on, especially at the UN, but more broadly in the international arena, really puts a bunch of uncomfortable pressure on American politicians. And I think that's, you know, an earlier version of the book was Cold War women's rights, because I really thought that I was making an analogous argument that the same thing happened for women, right? That the women's movement in the United States, and I spent, you know, it's not clear in the talk, but in the book, I spent a lot of time in declassified documents from the United States government. And around, for instance, the second presidential commission on the status of women, which is under Nixon, it is very clear, this is around the time of the discussion of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, which again, you know, our Constitution doesn't guarantee women's equality with men. And there was a big discussion about how embarrassing that was, given that the Soviets did that in 1917. And it was like 1970, you know, so there was a lot of anxiety about that. And it's very clear in those letters between Nixon and his advisors that he is being advised that women vote. And if you want women to vote for you in the next election, you have to do something about these demands that they're making. And B, and this is something that I find really fascinating, in the letter to Nixon, his advisors call it emergent responsible feminism. So these are the nice feminists who don't challenge the status quo. Those are the feminists you need to support. If you don't support the emergent responsible feminists, you're going to get people like Angela Davis. You're going to get people who are going to be creating a lot of unpleasant social upheaval for you. And so it's very, very clear that within sort of the FBI, within the kind of state apparatus in the United States, and there's a state apparatus in the United States, right? That they're kind of picking and choosing which women's organizations they're going to support. So for instance, in the FBI file on the National Organization for Women, for a long time, the National Organization for Women is considered a domestic threat. And the FBI is following them everywhere, what they're doing. And there's a huge discussion among different FBI agents whether they should continue to consider these women a domestic threat. And there's a change in the leadership of the FBI, and the all reports on the National Organization for Women continue to be sent to the Domestic Terrorist Threat Department. And the new leader of the FBI says, you guys, these are just women who are asking for like the right to go to work. Like they're not terrorists, they're not a threat. So there's a clear discussion that's happening within like the Federal Bureau of Investigation about whether or not these women who are demanding rights are actually a Soviet front, or, you know, the same way they called Martin Luther King a communist, right? And in the end, they decide, okay, no, like Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan are not like Soviet agents. They're just women who actually want, you know, women to be able to go to work and be paid equally, you know, but in the process of that, there's this whole complete othering of these other women, many of whom, you know, there was a big, strong socialist feminist movement in the United States, and they slowly kind of get pushed out and pruned out of the movement because the emergent responsible feminists don't want to be tainted with the brush of radicalism, and they decide to go the more, you know, politically acceptable route. And so it's very analogous, very, very analogous. Yeah. And there's tons of evidence. I mean, if I had the time and if I was better trained as an American historian, which I'm not, there's a book right there, right? Is to show how all of the government apparatus in the United States responded to Soviet and Eastern Bloc claims of women's emancipation and women's rights, and particularly how appealing those claims were to women in the developing world. Because women in the developing world, you can look at the Marianas Brigade in Cuba, you can look at the women who were fighting for the Viet Cong, you can look at all sorts of examples of women who took up arms to fight in liberation struggles. That was part and parcel of the liberation struggles. I have a colleague who works on women in North Korea. Again, they were worried, like women are picking, I mean, they're like arming themselves to fight with these struggles side by side with men, and that was considered a threat. So, yeah.
Thank you a lot for the talk. And yeah, I'm one of these Francisco Dehaan's students. Yeah, I work on the Soviet Women's Committee. And when I go through their archive, for example, I encounter very often their reflection on traditional gender roles. Precisely that problem that after the Second World War, their gender performance was very not traditional, not Western, kind of androgynous.
Yeah.
And it was not particularly welcomed by their Western sisters. And they reflected upon that a lot. Basically, each gathering of this committee was dedicated to the discussion how we should be more feminine, to please our Western comrades, to show them that Soviet project is not an anthropological catastrophe, you know, all that. And I started thinking a lot that, and I can see that the first generation of women in this committee, for example, those who went through the Second World War, they were very confident in their non-conventional femininity. They were proud of being not thin, tall, strong, not being too feminine. That was part of their Soviet women identity. But then I can see that it started changing. So they started adopting their programs to Western eyes. I remember during one plenums, they were like, we showed them already sewing courses for women, and they are still not convinced that we are feminine enough. What to do?
Yeah.
Right? And I think that these encounters also affected gender roles within the Soviet Union, for instance, right? So usually they're prescribed with some intrinsic logic, but it was not only that, right? So what is the case with Bulgaria? How did they reflect on these traditional roles? Whether there were any tensions, right? And yeah.
I think, I mean, I can show you a fascinating, I can find it here, an article from 1957, which very specifically is, let me see, I think it's this one, if I can find it. Oops, my daughter. Yeah, here we go. Let's see if I go full screen here, maybe I can show you. Yeah, so this is an article from 1957, before Sputnik, and this is the true story of Russia's weakness. And there's an entire section which is dedicated to Soviet women and how unfeminine they are. And the language is so incredible. The communist system has had a remarkable success in part quite unintentional in abolishing sex and keeping down the birth rate. A woman must, the argument runs, be free to develop her own personality and to make maximum contribution to the progress of the communist community. She must therefore have coordinate status with men, and above all, be independent of the man who, for mutual convenience, happens to be her husband. To be dependent on her husband is to become his slave, forced to do his slightest bidding and tied down to a dreary and fruitless life of keeping house and raising children. This is 1957, the Americans writing about the Soviets, right? And it's so clear that the images, they're not, you can't really see them very well, but the images of these women are so unfeminine. And when Nina Popova is at the United Nations as well, there's a lot of talk about the fact that she wears a black dress and she doesn't really wear any makeup. And they're like, how can she look like that, right? When the Americans are doing Dior's new look, right? They have just a completely hyper-feminism. So what I would, hyper-feminine look, what I would say is that in the Bulgarian context, there was less of an aggressive Western targeting of Bulgarian women in this case, right? The Russian woman, the babushka, the stereotype, right? Like the Wendy's ad was the stereotype. I do think that there, if you read, for instance, Slavenka Drakulic and How He Survived Communism and Even Laughed in the Croatian, the Yugoslav context, she speaks a lot about not feeling like women, that they didn't have lingerie and they didn't have makeup and they didn't even have, sometimes didn't have toothpaste, and it was humiliating, right? She has a wonderful quote where she says, the real Iron Curtain was made from the silky paper of the pages of Vogue magazine. That's what divided us. The women in the West had beautiful clothes and beautiful makeup and beautiful things, and we had emancipation, but we were ugly and we were tired. And so I think that narrative hugely actually impacted the way that women in the East did not appreciate things like kindergartens and creches and paid job protected parental leaves and public cafeterias and public canteens and public laundries and all of these different services that the state was providing. What they focused on was our clothes are ugly, right? We don't have feminine hygiene products. We don't have Pampers. We don't have makeup, or if we do have makeup, it's not good makeup. I mean, and I think that was part, I mean, that's the kitchen debate, right? That's the whole East-West divide around women. Well, American women may not have rights, but they have high-heeled shoes and lipstick and dishwashers and vacuum cleaners, and how wonderful to be an American woman, as opposed to the Soviet women who she has to have coordinate status with her husband, and she has to make a contribution, and she has to, you know, actually be a full participating member of society who's not a slave to her husband. I mean, it's written not ironically, right? They're saying that, oh, how that she, you know, forced to do his slightest thing, tied down to a dreary and fruitless life of keeping house and raising children. The dreary and fruitless life of keeping house and raising, I mean, that was the American ideal of femininity at the time, right? So it's really interesting. And again, just to emphasize, because I mentioned it, that article appears in the exact same year as this Woman Power report, which is where they're very anxious about the fact that the Soviets are graduating 13,000 women engineers a year, compared to under 100 in the United States. So these two narratives are happening at the same time. But I absolutely agree with you that images of glamorous Western women with lots of lingerie and makeup and clothes were, I mean, I think Drakulic has a point. The Iron Curtain was, for women at least, might have been made from the pages of Vogue magazine, right? The silky pages of Vogue magazine, because that was the aspiration that so many women had, was to have access to those goods, which is, you know, in retrospect, I think people suddenly realized that there was a trade-off. You don't get both, you get either or. Yeah.
The interesting thing, of course, as somebody who spent a lot of time in Russia in the 1990s and early 2000s, we Western women, especially the so scholarly one, we were the non-feminine ones compared to the hyper-femininity that was the rule. I remember lots of Russian men telling me, you're not really a woman at all.
Yeah, but I mean, I remember this, a very similar sort of thing, like, you know, being in Bulgaria in the 90s and not, you know, not wearing makeup or whatever, you know, wearing sandals in the summer and not heels. And people were like, but you have all these things, why would you not use them? And again, to quote, you know, Slavenka Draculic, she talks about how she says, why talk to us, East European women, about the manipulation inherent in the fashion and cosmetic industries? And I believe the direct quote is, to talk to us about the manipulation inherent in fashion is like warning a Bangladeshi about cholesterol, right? Like how, like you can't tell us, right, that this is a manipulative industry that preys on women's insecurities. We want more than anything to be manipulated by these industries. That's what she says. She admits that openly in the book, right? And she even goes on to say in another essay, you know, maybe our lives would have been different if we'd had lipstick and nice clothes. Then again, maybe they wouldn't have, but shouldn't we have had the right to find out for ourselves? That's, you know, that's her line. And I think that the fascination with a Western trope of femininity, hyper femininity, it goes throughout the whole of the Cold War. Like even, again, I mentioned earlier, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, right? When she's in 1942 in the United States, she's touring around with Eleanor Roosevelt, trying to convince the Americans to, you know, support a second Western front. And they say, like, why are you wearing that uniform? It makes you look fat. She's in a press conference, right? But first of all, they ask her stupid questions like, does she wear silk underwear? And does she powder her nose at the front? And she's like, well, there's no rule against it, but when you're in the middle of a battle, the last thing you're thinking about is powdering your nose, you know? But there's this wonderful exchange. And in fact, another paper that I'm written is about, it's actually a chapter in a book that's coming out next summer, is about Pavlichenko and the way that the Americans did not know what to do with her because she was feminine, but she was a sniper. She had 309 confirmed kills. And so they asked her at some point, they're like, why do you wear that uniform? It makes you look fat, like you don't look pretty in it. And, you know, she was very well spoken and she just stood up and she said, this is the army, this is the uniform of the Red Army with medals that I have earned, splattered with the blood of my comrades in battle. Do you think I care that it makes me look fat? I mean, so powerful. And then the American, you know, all of the press coverage of her is, wow, she's a woman, but she's a soldier. Wow, she's, you know, so delightful and warm, and yet she kills people in cold blood. They don't know how to reconcile those two things. And in fact, I would argue that Judith Butler's whole theory of gender performativity is right there in everything that Pavlichenko wrote, and because she wrote several articles for the US press in 42, 41, 42, it's all there. All there. She says, it's like when I feel like being a woman, when she describes in her memoir going to, what do you call it, enlist, because she's a sniper, she's got all her medals. She says, I put on my best high-heeled sandals and a crepe de chine dress. And I walked down, they wanted to make me a nurse and I insisted that I should sign up for the sniper brigade. So there's this wonderful tension there, right? And I think you're absolutely right that the Soviet women around the war and the immediate aftermath were very comfortable with the non-conventional gender roles. But then I think after the kitchen debates and after this constant onslaught of propaganda about how Soviet women were ugly and Soviet women were unfeminine and Soviet women were somehow an abomination to the idea of femininity, that there was a kind of reaction. And that's true I mean, I think all of the East European countries to a certain greater or lesser extent, but especially in the Soviet Union.
Questions from Zoom?
No.
I'll have one last question.
Sure.
I'm interested, I mean, there were a couple of underground feminist movements, such as the Group Maria in Leningrad, and I'm citing Soviet cases because that's what I'm familiar with. Where do they fit into your picture? Because they did in the end have to operate in the underground, and in the end they were all exiled, and then they sort of found their home in second-wave feminism in America, and then they come back in the 90s and have that sort of dilemma of the non-understanding we already talked about. But where do they fit in? Why can they not be incorporated?
I mean, I think that they could, and especially in the Yugoslav context, right? Dokulic was part of a very outspoken feminist movement as well. I think the thing is that they, to the extent that they were embracing a kind of Western feminism, it was really much more about individual autonomy. And I have had long and very heated debates personally with Mihaela Miroiu in her house in Bucharest about what it means for a social movement to be about individual autonomy versus some kind of group identity politics, whether that be women or workers or youth or pensioners or whatever. And there were many women, and I think this is true in every single of these East European countries, again, to a greater or lesser extent, who felt that the state committees concerned for, expanding kindergartens and creches didn't actually address their own desire for some kind of individual autonomy and individual identity. And that's where those things become there's a tension there. That's why they're underground. That's why it's all samizdat. That's why there are these problems where, Dokulic herself was one of the most outspoken critics of what she called emancipation from above. She has recently changed her tune. In her most recent book, she says, okay, fine, it was better, but we didn't appreciate it because we didn't understand what we didn't have, right? But I do think that that is one of probably the biggest critiques of these movements, is that it was never about individual women. It was never about you being able to live your life in the way that you want. It was always about sort of women as a class, and particularly women as a class of mothers and workers. And for many women, that was very constricting, right? That didn't feel satisfying, especially given, the narrative of women's emancipation, particularly that was coming out of the West, which was about a kind of, what's his name? Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Betty Friedan talks a lot about self-actualization, right? That once the bottom needs of the pyramid are met, food and health and shelter and security, self-actualization is the true pinnacle of human striving. And none of these movements, none of them really were concerned with self-actualization for anybody, not just women, right? Self-actualization was a particular product of a particular moment in psychology, I would say. I mean, Maslow's hierarchy of needs has been roundly criticized for its ethnocentrism in the aftermath, and it's still used widely. But I do think that that narrative of I mean, and I'm also sympathetic to it as well. I can understand that it would be very restricting if you feel like there are things that you want to do in your life that you can't do, and that gender is part of that inability to do those things. Having a movement through which you can realize autonomy and self-actualization is important. And yeah, in almost every case, that was being precluded by these official state women's organizations, which dominated the narrative of women's rights in these countries.
One final point, which I would like to make, because we had this whole aspect on the African and third world we have sort of not discussed as much, but I'm going to ask a very last provocative question. And you said something about the Cubans took the lead on Latin America, and let the Bulgarians, the Soviet let the Bulgarians take the lead on Africa. I was just wondering, I mean, in the end, it is, of course, another form of, dare I say, colonization, because in the end, it is, of course, white people's ideas
Mhm.
being spread into
Yeah.
as a space which might or might not want to adopt them. And I was just wondering what just to put it out.
Yeah.
Is that a justified critique, or is that
No, I mean,
how do people see it themselves these days, like the African women you interviewed, the Zambian women? Do they make that an issue, or is that not at all in their own subjectivity?
I mean, to the extent that modernity was desirable and decolonization from France, Portugal, the UK, right? I mean, Western colonies. Not a single one of these countries, perhaps the exception here would be Tanzania. Nyerere really talked about an African socialism that might have rejected modernity, a path to modernity. He was a little, in some of his writings, he's on the fence about it, right? He says we could have an agricultural society, traditional African agricultural society that is a happy functioning society. We don't need all of this stuff that the West and the industrialized countries want to give us. But for the most part, decolonizing countries in what we call the global South now, but then the third world, wanted modernity, and they needed it to come from somewhere because of, dependency theory. It was very, very difficult for them to get the resources in order to industrialize. Even if they had the resources, the natural resources, they didn't have the technology, they didn't have the know-how. Right, so much of what I found in the archives in Zambia, of the archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, archives of the Ministry of Industry, archives of the Ministry of Education, archives of the Ministry of Health, is exchanges of doctors coming and training doctors, of pedagogues coming and setting up universities, and of industrialists coming and paving roads and building dams. And these were things that a lot of these countries desperately wanted. Again, with, I would say, the exception of Tanzania, which sort of played with this alternative modernity or alternative path to modernity. But I think modernity was never in question. And so to the extent that modernity had these two very clear pathways, which were, as you say, quite rightly, both white European projects, their Enlightenment projects. Yes, if your goal was to remain a agricultural African society, subsistence agricultural society, then you really didn't have that choice. Generally speaking, I mean, yeah, but very few of them did, right? So it's a weird historical counterfactual. And what I think happens, and that's why Devaki Jain's quote from this book, Women at the UN, is so important, is that she says, look, there was this alternate path, right? State provision of services. There was a shelter that the kind of Eastern Bloc gave us from the rapacious, voracious, aggressive capitalist West that just wanted our resources and was, there was colonization and then there was decolonization, but then there was what they called neo-colonization, right? And especially when you think of the politics of places like South Africa or what was called Rhodesia before it became Zimbabwe. Southern Africa was awash with Soviet in particular, but Eastern Bloc aid to help resist these. That's why when Mozambique got its independence, there was this big party that they recognized that the Soviets had been supporting Frelimo. So yes, I mean, so yeah, just on a semantic level, yes, it was yet another Western white project to develop the South. There was an attempt at the non-aligned movement. They tried. And I think that, but again, the Yugoslavs were heavily involved. Tito was heavily involved in the non-aligned movement. And so, although, you can get into the difficulty of what the options were in the 70s and 80s in the period of decolonization. But I think from our standpoint, yeah, absolutely. It's true that it was a project of the North. Yeah.
So if I didn't know that you have to get your daughter to the airport very early tomorrow,
Yeah.
I would get into a long argument about this.
Right.
Who's the R? I mean, this is the view that the Enlightenment is a Western white project is really questioned in lots of developing countries,
Yeah.
formerly colonialist you can, I sometimes get annoyed about this claim because formerly colonized countries, you hear this kind of view much less than you do in wealthy white academic circles. And so I would question your saying this is from our point of view, because it's.
Well, all I'm saying is that if you were to make a claim, if you were to do this provocation and say, right, that ultimately all of these resources that largely flowed from east to south were a way of influencing, they weren't a way of influencing the developing world during the Cold War, of expanding the sphere of influence. Yeah, and so in that respect, right, but yeah, I mean, that's a very strong term, white colonialist project. But what I would say is, like, when you think of, and I absolutely 100% agree with you that all most of the leaders of these newly independent countries wanted the Enlightenment. Many of them had been educated. I mean, Nyerere himself.
Not just the technology.
Right. The ideas, yeah, they did. And Nyerere was in Scotland, and he studied in Scotland, and he came back, and he's the only one who said, you know, the values that they're teaching us are not our values. He's the only one who really, maybe not the only one, but he really explicitly explores the problem of what he calls sort of Western Enlightenment values, and particularly as regards to the education system, what British colonial education did to the aspirations and desires of African students. But that doesn't mean that he didn't want Tanzania to be a developed country, right? Or to be ultimately some kind of representative country where the people had a say in their system of government. And he just happened to think that African socialism was the path that would most achieve that. But yeah, I mean, to the extent that socialism and capitalism or democracy are both products of the Enlightenment, you're right. But to the extent that they were opposite projects in some ways, and certainly, I mean, there has been some really interesting research about just how much money the Eastern Bloc lost supporting countries in the global South, like to their detriment. And I could clearly see that in the documents. So, you know, the Americans would, you know, if they wanted tractors, the Americans would give them, you know, like a $10 million loan at a 15% interest rate payable over the next, you know, 12 years. And the Soviets were basically, we'll give you, you know, 100 tractors at a 2% interest rate paid over the next 50 years. You know, it was very clear. Now, maybe the Soviet tractors weren't as good, I don't know, but it was very clear that the aid that came from the West was much more predatory and extractive than the aid that was, you know, it was almost gifts that was coming from the Eastern Bloc. And so to the extent that it actually ends up doing damage, I think, to the economies of the Eastern Bloc, it's far less predatory than what was happening in the West. So I'll stop at that.
Yeah, I think for the sake of your daughter going to the airport, us having a meal, and other people dodging the incoming storm, we should draw a line here, but clearly lots to be discussed, not, I mean, to mention the role of China once we are in that kind of debate. But thank you so much for giving such an engaging talk and such vivid answers. And thank you for the Einstein Forum for organizing this evening. And I herewith give it a close.
Thank you.